Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Wolf and welcome to a preview of Beast Terror Fright. I'll be talking a little bit about the game's features as well as my own experience playing it. The game has been in early access as of the 7th of April 2015 and it's being developed by a company called Nornware. I've clocked just over 3 hours of the game and I felt that this game was very reminiscent of older shooter games like Doom crossed with the Alien movies. It's a very hard arcade-style, roguelike perma-death first-person shooter. You play as a marine who has to navigate a dark, claustrophobic, terrifyingly intense, and alien-infested spacecraft in order to extract critical data and lucrative upgrades. Now, bear with me because I am recording in a very hot room right now, so if I do sound a little bit tired, then that pretty much should explain it. There is no story to this game apart from what I pretty much just stated. There's no characters to interact with, and your character doesn't talk or anything like that. The enemies don't speak, they just try to hump your face with their alien space sticks. And I don't mind this one bit. I mean, like the story part, like the lack of story, never mind. Normally I prefer a story in a video game, but this is meant to be like one of those old arcade style shooters, so you just hop in and shoot stuff without having to listen to anyone's babbling. The game offers a few features and delivers on them fairly well. You have procedurally generated maze-like spacecrafts which are unique each time you play. There are spacecrafts which are infected with beasts or aliens which are extremely lethal. You get a few weapons to use like an automatic rifle or a shotgun. The data cores you look for contain upgrades which can give you better ammunition, better motion tracking, and other upgrades that increase your chance of survival. You're also given the option to use different tactical elements like doors, fences, and turrets, which I'll discuss when I get to my own experience with the game. There's local and network co-op as well. You can have up to 4 players in each mode, or 1 to 4 players in each mode. And something I liked is that both the local and network co-op can allow viewing of all players via split screen. My experience with the gameplay has been okay, but I say that with some reservation for a few reasons. This is partially because I don't like horror games and I kept dying a lot. I did, however, like that nearly everything about this game keeps you on your toes. I felt that while the gameplay had its charm, it's reasonable to consider the overall objective was somewhat rudimentary. The controls actually felt a bit weird to me, and this was because it didn't feel entirely like a typical FPS. It did have your standard WASD to move and mouse to point and shoot, but there's no way to aim down the sights, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. However, it felt really odd using the right click to interact with things. The controls are also extremely basic, again not necessarily a bad thing, but it'd be nice if you could control things like the torch or sprinting as well. Otherwise I had no major issues with the controls in general, just keep in mind I have yet to try playing with the gamepad. The gameplay isn't all that easy either. I knew it'd be hard when I bought it, yet for me it was still unexpected. Killing enemies was probably the easiest part until you encountered too many of them. On top of this, figuring out where to go, surviving against the constant wave of enemies, and using the right tactics wasn't as easy as I thought it would be. In addition to this, you can only repair your suit and replenish your health or ammo at these stations that were scattered throughout the level. These also had limited uses. Depending on the damage you took, you could eventually lose your entire heads-up display or HUD. Again, this can only be repaired at a station, and without the HUD, navigating the level got near impossible if you forgot where the stations were. This was made even harder by the fact that at some point the lights and power are cut off, leaving you with the limited visibility of where your dim torch was aimed. This is all while being hunted by aliens as well. Fortunately, you can find a circuit breaker to bring everything back up if you didn't die while hiding in a corner. Like a little bitch. There was also a tactical element to how you utilized the doors, laser fences, and turrets. Nothing in this game was infinite and either ran out of ammo, health, or power. The gunplay was okay, it didn't have too much going for it, but there was no reloading and enemies died fastish. The enemies could attack you from the ceiling or ground level, which meant you weren't just shooting in one spot constantly. It was overall somewhat fast paced, so I guess that was the big plus about it. The upgrades were a nice touch as well. This helped to ease a bit of the difficulty. The infrared vision, which you activated with the mouse wheel, made it easier to see enemies. The map upgrade added the ability to see corridors on the radar, so you could actually navigate a lot easier. The motion sensor upgrades helped a lot, especially when you got the long range upgrade. And there's a few more, but I won't go into too much detail here. I actually kind of like the style of difficulty that this game had. It made it a bit more dynamic in the sense that it got harder the more you played, but also balanced out the more upgrades you found. It wasn't anything unique, but just something that they did well. The game did feel pretty scary to me, but this is a bit of an arbitrary opinion. I don't tend to play a lot of horror games, if at all, but where this game does excel with the horror element is in its atmosphere, and it doesn't just throw cheap jump scares at you either. It felt like the game had a good balance between horror and action. You weren't just limited to walking around and hiding like certain other horror games out there. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing about them, but this seems to be going in a different direction and I like that. The heads-up display made things a bit difficult to understand, but what I liked was that it had a movement sensor. It's a bit cliche for an Alien game to do something like this, although it's surprisingly added to the fear level. This is because I knew something was there, I just didn't know where it was or when it was going to attack. This changes a bit when you upgrade the motion sensor because you can see the enemies on the radar. This game in general created an atmosphere that I liked a fair bit. It somehow made me want to rush in, but made me scared to do so at the same time. This is probably due to the combination of the music and the enemy sounds that followed. However, there were situations more often than not where I found myself camping in the corner like a little bitch. Not so that I could defend myself better, but so I could prepare to die. Like a little bitch. The game definitely has some interesting mechanics here and there. I did like how the doors were actually taken into consideration as part of the gameplay mechanics and used as a tactical element. This meant shutting all the doors behind you to prevent the aliens from infesting an area of the spaceship. This was a double-edged blade though because it made fleeing a bit harder. This difficulty was then increased if the power had cut out. With no power, the doors had to be pushed open and this took time. Time where you could be killed because you were too busy running away. Like a little bitch. The whole door being compromised thing was good too. It meant I couldn't always hide behind it like a little bitch. The laser fences worked in a similar way. They killed enemies who touched it, but if you passed through them, you would take damage as well. Another thing that made the fences dangerous was that bullets ricocheted off it and could hit you. I'm not sure if the same applies to turrets, but I'm guessing you can be killed if you stand in its line of fire. The procedural generation is great in how it works and made it feel different most of the time I played. I did encounter the same starting area a few times in a row, so it's a little bit hit and miss. There are situations where you start with the power on and off as well, which was nice. You do have the option to repeat the last mission if you died, which was great if you somehow felt more comfortable in that particular level. The only annoyance I had with this game was the endless wave of enemies and the constant deaths. I was only really able to get a good feel for the game after putting it on its easiest setting, and even then the enemies can still kill you fairly fast. Overall, most of the gameplay is done fairly well and comes together to create a tense, horrific and action-filled environment that makes you relish behind the short-lived safety of doors, fences or turrets. The visuals are actually pretty bad, and I very rarely say that about the games I feature on this channel. The textures were low resolution and weren't that great, the enemies didn't look that great, nothing really looked that great in this game. I guess the bonus here is that it wasn't too messy or too clunky looking. It still has some smoothness and detail to its design. The overall look of the game did give me a bit of a nostalgia trip too. It didn't actually bother me all that much, especially because the only time you really get to admire the graphics is when you're hiding somewhere, like a little bitch. That being said, I would have preferred modern day graphics that could have significantly helped to boost the atmosphere. Other than that, there is some good visual feedback, so you won't have many situations where you're struggling to see what's happening on the screen. The performance is actually really pretty good. I am playing on a GTX 980 Ti though, so I expected nothing less given the time frame between its early access release and now. I actually didn't notice any lag whatsoever, which is great for an early access title, but I'd be a lot more impressed if the visuals looked a lot better. The audio was great and probably the biggest factor that affected the atmosphere of the game. The music suited the game well. From the main menu, the music is pretty mellow, low-key, and it had a very 80s thriller sci-fi vibe to it. But when you clicked on the local game mode, the music got a bit more rhythmic and had a bit of a retro horror vibe to it, which is pretty much the best way I can describe it. In-game, the music started off fairly mellow and was fairly ambient, but when things started to get a bit hectic, the music gradually amped up and had a more industrial metal tone, which is good because it wouldn't be a throwback to some of the classic shooters if it didn't have some metal in it. What I liked was when the music was in its mellow state, it actually had these droning sounds that were reminiscent of a monster or alien, and it helped emphasize that horror vibe. Music was a little overbearing at times, so I did have to turn it down. The music changed dynamically to suit the situation in-game as well. In non-combat situations it was fairly low-key, but when enemies were near or attacking, it built up into a more aggressive melody. It did really well to get you pumped up, but constantly made you feel on edge. During the power outages, I loved how the music stopped abruptly and started back up when you flipped the circuit breaker. This meant when the music stopped, it left you with nothing but ambience, which got fairly scary and tense. Sound effects are actually fairly good. The enemy's alien-like footsteps and noises could be heard in multiple directions. This was kinda good because it made it a little bit harder to pinpoint the directions enemies were coming from, and this gave you the feeling that you were constantly surrounded by enemies. The aliens do sound scary and make you feel uneasy when you hear them as well. Other sound effects were pretty decent. They suited the game as much as you'd expect. Your own footsteps sounded heavy because of the suit you were wearing. Gunshots sounded okay. They were nice, loud, and overpowered a lot of the other sound effects. Then interactions with doors, objects, and all those other things all had audible sounds as you'd expect. Overall, the audio in general adhered to the sci-fi horror theme of the game pretty damn well. Now, the menu in general is more diverse than expected. You can actually choose to start a local or network game right from the start of the menu. There's a library option which seems to save some of the previous levels you played and generated prior. There's a help option, about option, and then there's the options themselves. When you pick a game mode, there's also some diverse options you can fiddle with before starting a game. I found it a little bit complicated to understand, but with some time, I got the hang of it. With some fiddling, I did find that there's some static difficulty options which range from easier, easier plus, hard, hard plus, insane, random all, and random each. Why this game has so many options, I have no idea, but I decided to set it to easier plus like a little bitch. Jokes aside, this allows a variety of skilled people to play and allowed me to take in the game a bit more. There are other options like the mission you could play and the type of level, which included corridors, dungeons, mazes, and mini-mazes, so it's very diverse in giving you control over how you could play the game. The menu and user face has an overwhelming amount of text and an odd-looking graphical user interface. In other words, it felt cluttered at times. The options menu, however, is very diverse. The control options are a bit limited, unfortunately, but there's some control options for all players. This is a great idea because not every player might have the same sensitivity and reaction speeds, so this gives them the option to tweak it to their liking without being restricted to whatever player one chooses. The audio options had separate sliders for special effects, ambience, and music. What was made interesting was that it also had a preferred music option, and this gives 8 different types of music to choose from. There was also an option for stingers to be turned on and off. I have no idea why, but more options are always welcome. The general options were nice, giving you things like preferred gender, show helmet, HUD color, aiming reticule, and more. Video options had some diverse choices, but nothing in depth enough that would allow you to tweak the performance. There was a downsampling option, but at its lowest setting, all it did was pixelate the game and make it blurry to an unplayable point. The development cycle of the game is looking okay so far. The most recent update was actually back in November 13th, 2016. So they seem to be averaging an update every few months, with their biggest gap being around 4 months. From what I can see, looking at the Nornware website and the update history, it looks like the game is only being developed by one guy. So that's pretty decent if it's a one-man team. I am looking forward to seeing the game being developed further, and hopefully this small team can pull it off. If you're interested, the game is currently going for $14.99 US cents on the Australian Steam page. I think the price is alright, but I'd only recommend it if you're into old school shooters and want something reasonably tough to play. There is even a demo you can try, but it doesn't represent the current state of the game. It's only really there to give you a feel for the game. I do feel given the basic objective of the game, it'll get repetitive despite the randomization of levels. The game has its charms though. By combining arcade mechanics and procedural generation with some tactical elements that you'd expect in modern day games, it does well to offer something interesting that keeps you coming back for more. But given that the game seems to be a throwback to much older games, even if it's unintentional, it's likely to have a specific and narrow targeted audience, so my recommendation is somewhat neutral. If you'd like to know more information on the game or the developer, there are going to be links in the description. There will be a follow-up video this week, so keep an eye out for that. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to share, like, subscribe, comment, all that fucking typical YouTube bullshit. I'd like to thank Nornware for allowing me to showcase this interesting game, and thank you to each and every one of you who watched the video this far. As usual, ladies and gentlemen, I will see you in the next video.